Rain fell like spilled nails on the crooked roofs of Gurnham, a village so far from any proper road that even the crows flew past in silence. The thatch of its home sagged, weighed down by moss and time. Smoke curled from chimneys with the lazy menace of forgotten fires. Ulrich arrived cold, soaked, and uncertain if he was still within the kingdom he'd left 3 weeks earlier. He was a scribe by trade, parchment-stained and road-weary, known for recording histories and stories from the mouths of peasants and priests alike. Gurnham was not on any map. That was what drew him. He'd heard of it in a whisper from a dying monk at the Abbey of Fenwal. The pantry still breathes beneath Gurnham, beware the snacks. Then the monk had choked on a spoonful of gruel and expired. Ulrich, curious and desperate for coin, had followed that dying breath across marsh, mountain, and mire. When he finally arrived, what he found was not welcoming. The villagers stared without speaking. Not just wary, haunted. As if their eyes saw more than they wished to admit. A baker watched him from behind a soot-smudged window, her floury hands twisting in anxiety. A boy gnawed on what looked like a strip of bark. When Ulrich passed close, he saw it was something darker, blackened meat or maybe, no, it couldn't be. At the inn, if the half-collapsed structure with a swinging sign that read, "The Hound's Tongue," could be called that, he found a man slumped over a bowl. The bowl smoked faintly. The man wasn't moving. Ulrich hesitated, then approached. The smell hit him like a slap. Boiled awful, but wrong, sweet in the way of rot, like fruit left in the sun until it weeps. The innkeeper emerged, one eye clouded over, the other bloodshot but alert. "He's not dead," he said flatly, gesturing to the slumped man. "Just full." "Full?" Ulrich asked. The innkeeper grunted. "You'll see." Ulrich had a room thrust upon him before he could argue. Supper was offered, stewed tongue paste with marrow fritters, the innkeeper said, but Ulrich declined, citing the cramps in his stomach from the road. The man laughed without humor. Upstairs, in a room that stank of mildew and age, Ulrich spread his scrolls. He wrote what he had seen. The silent villagers, the strange food, the innkeeper's tone. He scratched down one line twice. They are afraid of their own meals. That night, he didn't sleep. There were sounds from below. Wet, slapping sounds. The creak of floorboards under great weight. A whisper like boiling fat. And, once, a low groan that rose to a pitch Ulrich could only describe as hungry. At dawn, he found the slumped man gone. The bowl was still on the table, but now it contained something else, a dark jelly, congealed and pulsating slightly, like a sleeping slug. Ulrich leaned in. It smelled like cherries. And blood. He turned from it, revolted, and nearly collided with a woman holding a bundle of dried roots. "You don't eat what you don't know," she said. Her face was deeply lined, eyes yellow with age. "But in Gurnham, we all eat. Eventually." Ulrich asked her name. She gave none. "You'll want the church," she said. "That's where the pantry sleeps." The church loomed on the hill like a broken tooth. Its bell tower was split, and the doors hung open in a perpetual yawn. Ulrich found no priest. Only dust and a statue of Saint Malfred the Hungry, whose eyes were carved too large and whose mouth stretched too wide. Behind the altar, a door lay hidden beneath a sheet of nailed boards. Ulrich saw the marks, clawing from the inside. And beneath that, words carved in Latin. "Here lies the pantry. Let it starve." Ulrich felt a chill colder than the wind outside. He copied the inscription and returned to the village, where the market had appeared as if conjured. Stalls offered food he'd never seen before. Blood-glazed apples that steamed in the morning air, pies with crusts that shimmered like fish scales, cheeses that whispered when sliced. He approached one stall, manned by a girl no older than 12. "What is this?" he asked, pointing to a dark red tart. "Liverberry delight," she said. "It makes you dream of people you've never met." He blinked. "Is that a good thing?" She smiled. "Better than dreaming of the ones you've eaten." He stepped back. The villagers watched. That night, hunger gnawed at Ulrich's belly. He dared not eat what the innkeeper offered. Instead, he chewed a crust of old bread from his pack. It tasted like dust. But his dreams were full of strange flavors. Spice he'd never known, fat that crackled like fire, sweets that wept nectar. And a voice, whispering in his ear. "Come, taste, remember." He awoke sweating. And hungry. Always hungry. Ulrich woke with a dry tongue and a mouth full of ash. At least, that's how it felt. The stale crust he'd eaten the night before sat like a rock in his gut, yet his hunger had not abated, it had grown, ripened into something sharp and curling. His hands trembled. The morning light crept through the shutters like a guilty child, and the sounds from outside felt distant and warped, as though he were underwater. He made his way down to the taproom. The innkeeper was ladling thick gray gruel into bowls for the few villagers present. They ate in silence, their eyes dull, spooning the slop with mechanical regularity. No one looked up as Ulrich passed. The man with the bowl from the night before was back, this time fully conscious. His face was sallow, skin drawn so tight across his cheekbones that it looked like a mask. He smiled as Ulrich approached, and his teeth were stained black. "Slept well?" he asked, voice rasping like a rusty hinge. "No," Ulrich said. "What is that you're eating?" The man glanced down at his bowl, then back up, his grin widening. "Spoiled feast." Ulrich blinked. "Pardon. That's the name. Spoiled feast. Or sometimes, penance porridge. Depends on the batch." He stirred the thick sludge with his spoon, revealing chunks of something that might once have been meat, only now they were soft, gray, and fizzing slightly. "Why would anyone eat that?" Ulrich asked. "Because we have to," the man said. "It calls." He leaned in closer, breath sour and heavy. "You've heard it, haven't you? In your dreams." Ulrich stiffened. The man chuckled and shoved a spoonful into his mouth. "First sign," he said around the bite. "The dreams. Then the hunger. Then the taste for the strange." Before Ulrich could reply, a shriek rang out from outside the inn. High and sudden, it pierced the morning like a dagger through cloth. Every head in the room turned. Ulrich darted out the door. A small crowd had gathered at the market square. At its center stood a young woman, her apron stained red, not with blood, but with a syrupy, fruit-like glaze. She was screaming, pointing at her stall. It moved. She cried. The pie, it was breathing. Ulrich pushed his way through. On the wooden table lay a pie that was mostly crumbled now. Its crust cracked, its filling spilled, and steam still drifted lazily from its ruptured shell. The crowd murmured. "Someone ate it?" a villager asked. The young woman nodded, pale. "A traveler. Tall, black beard. He tried it, said it tasted of honey and ashes. Then he started laughing." A man at the edge of the crowd stepped forward. "I saw him run into the chapel. Screaming about the pantry. Said he wanted more." They all fell silent at that. The pantry. That word again. Ulrich turned to speak, but the villagers were already dispersing, mumbling prayers, crossing themselves. Only the young woman remained, eyes wide. "I bake what the book says," she whispered. Ulrich narrowed his gaze. "What book?" She looked around, then thrust a hand under her apron and produced a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "Don't tell them I gave it to you." He took it. The fabric was oily, oddly warm. When he unwrapped it, a waft of rancid sweetness rose into his nostrils.
The book's cover was leather, patched together from different textures and hues. Sewn with silver wire. It was thin, but dense. The title etched into the hide read, "The Pantry's Breath." "What is this?" Ulrich asked. "Recipes," she said. "Old ones. My grandmother baked from it. So did her mother. Every family in Gurnham has a copy, though most keep it hidden. Where did it come from? No one knows. It was found under the church. Buried with the chef." Ulrich looked at her sharply. "What chef?" She backed away. "I've said too much. Just don't eat anything. Not unless it calls your name." She vanished into the thinning fog, leaving Ulrich with the bundle. He returned to the inn and opened the book in his room. Each page was handwritten in brown ink that he knew wasn't ink. The recipes were absurd, ingredients that included powdered fingernails, fermented crow's tongue, echoes of bread, and measurements like, "a regretful handful," or, "until the moon recoils." He flipped to a page marked by a dried thistle. "Boar's brain biscuits. For visions. For courage. For cruelty. 3 ounces boar brain, raw. 1 tablespoon soul salt, harvested from dreamers. 2 regretful handfuls of barley. Mix under moonlight. Bake until they weep. Consume while humming. Asterisk. A note at the bottom, scrawled in shaking script, read. Do not feed to children. They see too clearly." Ulrich stared at the page, the lines swimming before his eyes. He felt lightheaded. The hunger gnawed deeper. He turned another page. Ashen tarts of remorse. Eat to forget. Eat to remember. Eat to regret. There were dozens more, all written in the same feverish hand. Suddenly the room grew darker, as though a cloud had passed over the sun. Ulrich looked up, and saw that the window had not changed. No shadow. No storm. It was something else. The book. It pulsed. He slammed it shut. The air snapped back to normal. The room brightened. His hands were cold. Outside, a bell rang. From the church. Ulrich stood, grabbing his satchel and the book. He felt like he was stepping into a larger story, one that had already decided its ending. But he would not go quietly. He needed to see the pantry for himself. And he needed to know what the hell was cooking in Gurnham. Ulrich made his way back up the hill toward the church, the leather-wrapped recipe book pressing like a coal against his ribs inside his satchel. The sky had not changed, yet the air felt heavier, thick with the scent of boiled meat and something subtler, something like burning parchment. Each step brought with it the strange sensation that he was being watched not just from behind, but from within. The bell had stopped ringing. The church of St. Malfred stood silent now, half devoured by ivy, its cracked walls leaning inward like a withered skull. Ulrich stepped over broken flagstones and through the crooked archway, back into the hushed sanctum. The same statue greeted him, St. Malfred with his gluttonous mouth, hands outstretched, carved bread in one, a bleeding fish in the other. Ulrich's eyes were drawn again to the rear of the chapel, behind the altar where the hidden door lay. The planks nailed across it were older than most buildings he had seen in the village, darkened by time, gnawed by rats or something larger. Still nailed shut, still scratched from within, and yet, the door was ajar, not much, less than a finger's width, but enough that cold, damp air spilled out from the crack. It smelled of deep soil, mildew, and something spiced, like clover pepper. Something that didn't belong in the earth. Ulrich hesitated only a moment. Then he removed the pack from his shoulder, pulled out the book, and flipped it open. The pages fluttered on their own, stopping at one marked with a smear of rust-colored stain. The pantry beneath. There was no recipe on this page. Just a passage. Those who hunger may enter, but must not feast. Those who feast must not speak. Those who speak must not hunger again. Ulrich whispered the words aloud, the air seeming to hum with tension as he did. Then he placed the book back in the pack and pressed his hand against the door. It gave way without resistance. Beyond it lay a stone stairwell descending into darkness. Each step was narrow, slick, and uneven. The walls were coated in patches of moss that glowed faintly green. He touched one, and it smeared beneath his fingers like oil. The light above grew distant as he descended. The smell changed, less decay, more cooked things. Baked things. Sugar and char. He began to hear faint noises. Clinks of cutlery, the creak of wooden wheels, the shuffle of bare feet. Then the stairs ended. He stood in a long hallway, carved into the earth and braced with old wooden beams. Hooks lined the walls, some still holding dried, unidentifiable cuts of meat. Others held things that weren't meat at all. Bundles of herbs with black leaves, sacks that twitched faintly, a jar filled with pickled teeth. The passage sloped down and opened into a small chamber. It was a kitchen, of sorts. An ancient hearth sat cold in one corner, a blackened pot still hanging from the iron arm above the ashes. A stone table ran the length of the room, pitted with use. On it sat 3 bowls, each labeled in Latin, Fortis, Dolor, Memoria. Courage, pain, memory. Each bowl held a grayish paste. Not liquid, not solid. The smell from them was overpowering, like salted bile mixed with honey. Ulrich stepped closer. His stomach growled. His fingers trembled again, not with fear, but hunger. The kind that speaks in your ear and tells you that no matter how disgusting, no matter how wrong, what sits in that bowl is meant for you. That it will help. He clenched his fists. No, he muttered. Not like this. A sound behind him made him spin. A door creaking open from a shadowed wall he had not noticed before. A voice floated out, low and oily. Someone's hungry. Ulrich backed away from the bowls. Who's there? The voice chuckled. They always come when the dreams begin. You've had them, haven't you? The recipes. The smells. He could see movement in the dark, a figure hunched low, walking with a limp, dragging something heavy. A sack. No. A ladle. The largest ladle Ulrich had ever seen, the size of a man's arm. It shone with dampness, and something clung to its edge, bits of rind, bone, and skin. Come in, the voice said. The next batch is nearly ready. Ulrich stepped back toward the stairway. The bowls pulsed gently. I came only to see, Ulrich said. I won't eat. The figure paused. Oh, but it's not up to you. Once the pantry calls, the menu writes itself. The ladle raised. Ulrich turned and fled. He scrambled up the stairs, the air tightening around his chest as the walls seemed to lean closer, the moss brushing against his face like fingers. Behind him, the ladle clanged against stone, then silence. He burst into the chapel, gasping, the door slamming shut behind him with a deafening crack. When he looked back, it was gone. The planks were nailed shut again. And in his hand, one of the bowls. Dolor. It hadn't been there before. He hadn't taken it. Yet here it was, warm in his palms, the gray paste inside swirling slowly. He nearly dropped it, but something in the scent tugged at him. A sweetness. A promise. He sat before the altar, bowl in lap. Don't eat it, he thought. Not yet. But already, the dreams stirred in his skull. And somewhere below, the pantry exhaled. Ulrich didn't remember walking back to the inn. One moment he sat in the cold chapel with the bowl of dolor in his hands. The next, he stood outside the Hound's Tongue, the cracked wooden door swinging open as if to welcome him back inside. He looked down. His hands were empty. No bowl. The village seemed quieter than before. A heavy, bloated quiet. The kind that settled after a feast, or a funeral. Inside, the innkeeper was scrubbing the bar with a rag so stained it could have once been a flag of war. He looked up only briefly when Ulrich entered. "Soup's still warm," he said. "If you're ready." "I'm not hungry," Ulrich muttered. The innkeeper didn't argue. He only nodded slowly and kept scrubbing. Ulrich climbed the stairs to his room, locked the door behind him, and sat down on the bed. The room smelled different now. Something had changed. Not just a scent, it was a presence. The feeling of being watched had followed him up from the pantry. He unwrapped the book again. This time, the pages opened not where he left them, but to a new recipe, one not previously there. Döler custard. For the softening of memory. For feeding guilt. For those who mourn with appetite. One confession, written or spoken. 2 yolks from sleepless hens. 1 measure of stolen sweetness. Stir with regret. Heat with grief. Serve cold. Asterisk. He slammed it shut. Something inside him shuddered, not from the recipe, but from how familiar it felt. As if it had been waiting for him. As if the pantry now knew him. He stared at his hands. Had he picked up the bowl? Had he eaten from it? He didn't remember. But he tasted something. A metallic, mealy flavor on his tongue. Like tears mixed with ash. A knock at the door startled him. "Go away," Ulrich called. But the knock came again, this time softer, more deliberate. He opened the door to find the old woman who had spoken to him before, the one who warned him about eating what he didn't know. She looked worse now, thinner. Her cheeks sunken, her lips cracked. "You've been below," she rasped. Ulrich nodded. "I thought so," she said. "You're changing. What do you mean?" She reached into the folds of her cloak and produced a small mirror. Not silvered, just polished metal, but when Ulrich looked, he drew back. His eyes were wrong. Not just bloodshot. Red. The whites had dulled to the color of bruised meat. His skin had a waxy sheen. And his teeth, his front two were sharp. Barely. But noticeably. "I haven't eaten anything," he said. "No," she agreed. "But the pantry doesn't need your mouth. It feeds through your dreams. It feeds through your want." He staggered back, pressing a hand to his lips. "This isn't real." "Real enough," she whispered. "That's why I came. To help you. Before the hunger finishes nesting." She handed him something wrapped in cloth. Lighter than the book, but firmer than food. He unwrapped it. A spoon. Old, carved from dark wood. On its handle were burned the words, "Refuse the bite." "It's from the old days," she said. "Before they gave in." "They?" he asked. "The founders. The ones who settled Gurnham. They found the pantry by accident. Thought it was a blessing. Recipes that appeared in their heads. Meals that cured fevers. That filled empty bellies. They believed it was divine. But it wasn't." "No," she said. "It was hungry. And it learned to cook souls." Ulrich swallowed. "And now they live like this. Bound to it," she said. "If they stop eating, they wither. If they eat too much, they disappear. Only the balance keeps them human." "And what about me?" She looked at him long and hard. "You're on the menu." He felt a chill travel his spine. "Can it be stopped?" She shook her head slowly. "Maybe. But it must be starved." Shut. The door sealed again. And the recipe book destroyed. Ulrich looked down at the volume. The leather binding seemed to squirm under his hand, like something alive had been stitched into it. His stomach twisted. "I'll burn it," he said. She laughed, bitter and hollow. "You can't. Not in this world. You'd need something pure. Something real. Fire from above." He was about to ask what she meant when the air in the room suddenly changed. The floorboards creaked. A thick, sweet smell seeped in through the walls. She froze. It knows we're speaking. The book flared hot in his hands. The mirror in her pocket cracked with a sharp ping. "We've stayed too long," she said. "Take the spoon. Hide the book. Tonight, go to the chapel again. I'll meet you there at moonrise. There's something else you must see." She turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Ulrich," she said, "if you start to crave the taste of things that aren't food, dirt, paper, skin, you must fight it. That's how it begins." And then she was gone. He stood there, heart hammering, the wooden spoon clutched tightly in his fist. The recipe book pulsed once. And from the far wall, behind the boards of the inn's frame, he heard the unmistakable sound of something chewing. Even with the spoon gripped in his fist and the book locked inside the trunk at the foot of his bed, he knew that dreams would still find a way in. Sleep, like hunger, had become a pathway now, a road that led down, ever downward, toward that shifting kitchen of shadows and smoke. So he sat by the window, watching the moon crawl across the black sky like a wound healing wrong. Gurnham lay quiet below, its chimneys cold, its streets oddly vacant for a village that once bustled with midday markets and late-night gossip. Now, windows were shuttered and doors barred tight. Even the rats, he noticed, had stopped scratching in the walls. It wasn't fear. It was digestion. At midnight, he stepped outside. The air was crisp, but not clean. There was a trace of rot in the wind, sweet, like overripe fruit left too long in the sun. Ulrich walked quickly up the hill, past empty stalls and silent houses, past the statue of Saint Malfred with its ever-hungry eyes. The church greeted him like a mouth, the arched doorway a set of broken teeth. Inside, he found the old woman waiting, just as she had promised. She no longer looked frail. In the moonlight streaming through the shattered rose window, her shape seemed firmer, her spine straighter. Something in her face had changed, less fear, more certainty. "You came," she said. "I didn't have a choice." "There's always a choice," she said, "but the price changes." She led him behind the altar, where the sealed door still waited, though now the nails had begun to rust and shift, as if pushed from the other side. "We're not going down," she said. Ulrich blinked. "Then why are we here?" "To open another door." She reached into her cloak and pulled out something wrapped in pale cloth. When she peeled it back, Ulrich recognized what it was, a ladle. Similar to the one carried by the figure in the pantry, but this one was scorched and split at the handle. Strange symbols had been carved into the bowl of it, runes he couldn't read but which seemed to throb with heat. "What is that?" he asked. "A key," she replied. "To an older place." Ulrich felt cold fingers clutch at his thoughts. "Older than the pantry." She nodded. "There's a route deeper than the cellar. Beneath the pantry's hearth is a trapdoor, hidden under the soot and bone. That's where the hunger began. Before the book. Before the recipes. Before Gurnham was Gurnham. You want me to go there. I want you to see what's cooking." Ulrich hesitated. "Why me?" "Because the pantry chose you." "That doesn't sound like a reason to trust me." She smiled faintly. "It's the best one there is." From the folds of her cloak, she pulled a small bundle and handed it to him. Inside, a shard of mirror, a sprig of wolfsbane, and a twist of linen soaked in black vinegar. "For the smell," she said. "You'll understand." Ulrich tucked the bundle inside his coat. "And what about you?" "I'll wait here. The pantry fears fire. But the root fears truth. That's your weapon. And if I don't come back, you'll still be hungry," she said grimly. "But you won't be alone." Ulrich descended once more into the pantry. This time, the steps seemed softer, less stone, more bone. The glow from the moss was weaker, almost apologetic. The hooks along the walls held nothing now. The jars were empty. Even the air felt hollow. The kitchen was waiting. He crossed it in silence, not pausing at the bowls or the hearth. He stepped around the stone table and reached the far wall, where the ashes from the hearth had piled thick. He knelt and brushed it away, and there it was, a trapdoor, made of meek dark wood banded with iron. The runes on the ladle flared faintly as he held it near. A click echoed. The door opened. A ladder descended into blackness. Ulrich climbed. The first thing that struck him was the smell. Not rot, not even death, but something more primordial, despair cooked down into tar, spiced with grief. He covered his mouth with the vinegar-soaked linen and pressed on. The space at the bottom was not a room. It was a tongue. The stone under his feet was slick, not with moisture, but with some secretion. The walls were curved, striated like muscle. The ceiling arched into shadows that quivered when he moved. There were no torches, only a faint internal glow, like fireflies trapped inside meat. At the center of the chamber sat an oven. Not of brick or stone, but of bone. It pulsed, slowly, like a heart, and from its open door came a steady stream of steam. Not water, but memory. Ulrich saw flashes in the haze. Children weeping beside empty bowls, a woman kissing a man with blood on his chin, villagers gathered around a pit, hands outstretched. And then, he saw himself. Biting into the dollar. He staggered back. The oven noticed. Its lid clamped shut. The chamber rumbled. And from the walls, 3 figures emerged, faceless, their flesh stitched from hunger. Aprons stained. Eyes replaced with utensils. One held a cleaver. One, a mixing bowl. The third had no hands, only ladles fused to its arms. Ulrich pulled the ladle key from his belt. "Stay back," he warned. The figures stopped. The ladle's runes glowed again. The oven cracked. A scream, high, brittle, not human, spilled out. Ulrich raised the spoon given to him by the old woman, the one carved with "refuse the bite." He drove its handle into the floor. The chamber howled. The oven split. From inside spilled pages, hundreds of them, recipes half burned, twitching, bleeding ink. He turned to run, the 2 utensils clattering behind him. But he heard something then. A voice, his own, yet not. "Ulrich," it whispered, "don't leave the meal unfinished." He didn't look back. He climbed the ladder, slammed the trapdoor shut, and sealed it with the ladle's handle. The kitchen above him was cold now. The bowls were gone. The table cracked. The air, still, for once. He staggered back to the church. The old woman was waiting. "You saw it," she said. "I did. And it's not a pantry," Ulrich said. "It's a mouth. The village is the meal." She closed her eyes, nodded once. Then said, "And now, you know how to starve it." Ulrich and the old woman did not speak again until the first pale fingers of dawn reached through the chapel's broken windows. Outside, Gernham remained still, but it was the stillness of a body not yet buried. The bell in the tower no longer rang. The birds no longer sang. Even the wind seemed reluctant to pass through the square. Inside the church, Ulrich sat slumped beside the altar, the weight of what he had seen dragging his shoulders low. His hands were blistered from gripping the spoon so hard. The ladle key, now blackened at the runes, lay cooling in the dust beside him. The old woman stirred from her vigil by the statue of Saint Malfred. "You survived," she said softly. "I think so. That's more than most." Ulrich rubbed his eyes. "What happens now?" "Now," she said, "you learn how to kill hunger." He didn't reply. He wasn't sure he had the strength to fight something that cooked sorrow and served guilt in bowls. "You've seen its heart," she continued. "But that wasn't the end. That was just the stove. The recipe that fuels all others is still out there." Ulrich looked at her sharply. "There's more than one book. There are always more pages," she said. "They spread like disease. Carried in memory, in dreams, in words shared too often at a table." She reached into her cloak again and pulled out a second book, not bound in leather like the first, but wrapped in a cloth embroidered with protective sigils. "This one's different," she said. "This one fights." Ulrich took it slowly. It was heavier than it looked. When he opened it, the pages were blank. He flipped through several, then looked at her with confusion. "You said this was a weapon." "It is," she said. "But it doesn't write itself." "You do." Understanding clicked slowly into place. "You want me to write new recipes?" "No," she said. "I want you to replace the old ones. For every dish that feeds on grief, you must create one that nourishes truth. For every stew that thickens with memory, make one that clears it. It's not just food. It's remedy." Ulrich stood, a little straighter now. "How? You have the spoon. You've tasted the dark. You'll know what to avoid. And you'll have me." She moved toward the chapel doors and pushed them open. Morning light spilled in, weak, golden, but real. And Gurnham, strangely, had started to move. A few villagers emerged into the square, blinking like sleepers. "They don't know," Ulrich whispered. "They suspect," she said. "But knowing would make them mad. It's better that they suspect. While we work." Ulrich stepped outside, the book under his arm, the spoon at his belt. The sky above looked almost ordinary. Only a faint tinge of ash on the wind betrayed what simmered beneath their feet. "So we cook," he said quietly. "We uncook," the old woman corrected. And so began the strangest phase of Ulrich's life. He became, to all appearances, Gurnham's new cook. He took up the hearth at the inn, now vacated by its silent, shivering former owner. He reworked the pantry, clearing out jars of black honey and jars of weeping mushrooms. He replaced them with herbs from beyond the river, grains that sang when milled, water from the chapel's hidden cistern. The villagers came cautiously at first, drawn not by smell but by something deeper, the soft promise of food that didn't demand a part of you in return. Ulrich served broths that lightened nightmares. He baked bread that hummed lullabies into your sleep. He stewed root vegetables until the pain from old wounds softened in the joints of the eaters. He wrote the recipes into the blank book each night. With each one, the glow from its pages grew steadier. But the pantry, it was not idle. Late at night, Ulrich still heard it shifting below, chewing on memories it had already eaten 1,000 times. Sometimes, a knock would come at the cellar door, 3 soft raps, like a cook calling for service. The trapdoor beneath the hearth would breathe shallowly, and the scent of burning guilt would waft into the inn like a warning. And then, the counter recipes began to appear. Folded into vegetables. Scribbled onto napkins. Etched in soot onto his cookpot. He found them everywhere. They read like temptations. Bitter harvest pie, eat to forget names. Sorrow brûlée, for a lighter grief with a sweet crust. Child's tongue jam, pairs well with breakfast. Especially orphans. He burned every one. The old woman visited weekly. Sometimes she brought wild ingredients. Sometimes she brought news. Once, she brought a boy who had eaten a single bite of mirthless marrow stew and hadn't stopped laughing for days. Ulrich gave him boiled barley and a syrup of elderflower in silence. The boy slept at last. Word of Ulrich's food spread, not far, but just enough. Strangers came, wanderers, pilgrims. One man with eyes like burnt almonds and a mouth full of teeth that were not his own. Ulrich fed them carefully, testing each for signs of the pantry's influence. Most passed. One did not. He had ordered stew. Eat in half. Then whispered, "It's almost as good as Döhler." Ulrich struck him with the ladle before the man could finish his sentence. The old woman helped bury him near the chapel. The village never asked. As weeks passed, the air in Gernham changed. Windows opened earlier. Doors stayed unbarred. Children played in the square again, though they never, ever touched the bell rope. The statue of Saint Malfred, once a looming presence, grew cracks in its base. No one repaired them. One evening, as the sun dipped blood orange behind the tree line, Ulrich served a roast made with lamb, turnips, and rosemary. A family of 5 ate in silence, then wept, not from sorrow, but relief. The father touched Ulrich's hand. "You saved her," he said, nodding toward his wife. She hadn't spoken since the yellow broth. Ulrich only nodded, then turned to the book and wrote, "Restorative roast, for those recovering from feasts that feed on silence." The ink glowed silver. He smiled. And far below, in the pantry's lowest place, something howled. Not with rage, but hunger. Because now, it was being starved. It began with the pigeons. One morning, just as Ulrich was finishing a recipe for a curative porridge that soothed the pain of bad dreams, he noticed the rooftops were empty. Not a single bird preened or cooed atop the thatched inn or the chapel steeple. Even the usual scatterings of droppings that annoyed him were gone, wiped clean overnight. The village had gone silent again, not from fear, but anticipation. The air shimmered with it. Something was coming. Ulrich stood in the courtyard, spoon in hand, and watched the sky. A high wind stirred the ashes in the hearth, but the fire didn't go out. The ladle at his belt vibrated faintly, the way it had before the trapdoor opened beneath the pantry. He went inside and found the old woman already there. She had entered without a sound. Her cloak was torn. Her hair hung loose. Her face, usually composed even in the presence of horrors, was pale with strain. "It has sent a scout," she said before he could ask. Ulrich gritted his teeth. Another servant. Worse. A taster. Ulrich had heard that term once before, but not in this context. She explained. "Tasters are not bound like the servants. They walk freely. They speak kindly. They look like us, eat like us. But they carry the pantry in their mouths. One word from them can turn your kitchen." "Turn it how?" She hesitated. "They poison expectation. They twist hunger into belief. Make villagers crave dishes that don't exist, yet." Ulrich stepped back. "So people invent the meals themselves. And the pantry prepares them." He felt sick. "Where is this taster now?" he asked. She looked toward the window. "He arrived at dawn. Calling himself Brother Porlin. A traveling monk. Already preaching." She nodded. "He says he's fasting, but he's not. He's seasoning." Ulrich didn't waste time. He took the ladle key, the vinegar bundle, and the book of clean recipes, then walked directly into the square. Brother Porlin stood in front of the chapel, addressing a small crowd. He was round and cheerful, with a robe too tight across the belly and hands that never stopped gesturing. His voice had the buttery texture of someone who had tasted too much pleasure and had learned how to share its memory with words alone. "I tell you," Porlin boomed, "the Lord teaches us to break bread in fellowship, not fear. There is no shame in flavor. No sin in spice. Eat boldly, my friends." The villagers murmured. Several nodded. Ulrich pushed through them, all the way to the front. "Brother Porlin," he said. Porlin turned, eyes glinting. "Ah, the famous cook. the healer of soups, the restorer of roasts, a pleasure. His tone was friendly, but Ulrich's skin crawled. I've heard you speak, Ulrich said. It's very persuasive. Porlin bowed. Words are ingredients, friend. Some know only how to boil them. Others, like myself, simmer slowly. Ulrich held up the book. I've been rewriting the recipes, replacing what the pantry put in this village. Porlin's smile didn't falter. Yes, and how noble. But let's not forget, some hungers were meant to be fed. Not like that, Ulrich growled. Porlin raised an eyebrow. Who decides which bites are forbidden? You. The crone hiding behind your counter. If someone wants to remember pain, what right have you to take that from them? I'm not taking. I'm healing. Porlin stepped closer. You think you're helping, but you're stealing from the table. People crave suffering dressed in sugar. They miss the stew of shame, the sauce of sorrow, the delicate custard of childhood guilt. They ache for it. You're lying, Ulrich snapped. Porlin leaned forward. You tasted the dolor, didn't you? Ulrich said nothing. I can see it in your eyes. You liked it. Part of you still does. The air grew thick. Something about Porlin's breath smelled wrong, like nutmeg and embalming fluid. The villagers shifted uneasily. Ulrich took a slow breath. If you want to test my kitchen, come eat. One bite of my food. Porlin grinned. Gladly. They walked together to the inn. The villagers followed, curious and cautious. Ulrich lit the fire beneath his newest dish, a stew of lentils, golden carrots, and slow-simmered hope. It had no name yet, but the moment Porlin stepped inside the kitchen, the stew reacted. The steam curled defensively, the scent thickened, and the broth turned from warm to wary. Ulrich ladled out a bowl and placed it in front of Porlin. Eat, he said. Porlin sniffed. He paused, then spooned the stew to his lips and swallowed. A moment passed. Then another. Porlin's smile broke. Just a crack. Then he coughed, once, violently. His skin flushed red. His robe twitched at the seams. And from his mouth came not a curse, but a scream, high, like a boiling kettle, too loud for a human throat. The villagers stepped back. The old woman raised a hand and murmured something in a forgotten tongue. Porlin collapsed, writhing. His belly split, not blood, but ink spilled out. Globs of it, thick and twitching, scurried across the floor like beetles. Ulrich seized the ladle and slammed it into the pool. The runes flared. The ink shrieked, curled, and turned to ash. When it was over, Porlin was gone. Only a pile of cassock fabric and teeth remained. Silence fell. The old woman approached and looked at the ash. It wasn't just a taster, she said. It was a baker. Trying to rise again. Ulrich dropped into a chair, shaking. I almost believed him. She placed a hand on his shoulder. That's how they get in. Through hunger, yes. But also through doubt. Ulrich turned to the book. With trembling hands, he wrote the stew's first name. Clearbroth Courage, a recipe that reveals the mouth behind the mask. The ink shone gold. Outside, the pigeons returned. In the weeks after Brother Porlin's fall, the village of Gurnham teetered on the edge of change. Ulrich could feel it, like a pot hovering on the edge of boil, tension just beneath the surface. His kitchen had grown quiet, not from lack of use, but from a strange reverence. People came now not just to eat but to heal, and they spoke in whispers, as if afraid to wake something that still lurked in the walls. The pantry was still there. It always would be. But it no longer dared open its door without a fight. Ulrich had begun to sense its moods, the way a good cook senses the weather in flour or the mood of a fire in the snap of wood. Sometimes the pantry pulsed with low displeasure, like a beast sulking after being wounded. At other times, it seemed still, watching, waiting. And then, one night, the trapdoor shuddered again. But this time, it didn't open. Instead, a knock came. Not the three polite raps of a servant, or the hungry scratching of a shade. This was one heavy thud. Then silence. When Ulrich opened the trapdoor, there was no steam. No scent of rot or regret. Only a basket. A wicker basket, bound with twine. No card. No sigil. No sign of origin. The old woman was summoned before dawn. She stood with Ulrich over the basket as it sat on the table in the inn's kitchen. Neither of them touched it. "I've seen this before," she said quietly. "It's a false gift. A temptation. From the pantry. From deeper than that. Something older." Ulrich frowned. "Older than the pantry. The pantry is a symptom, not a source," she said. "It started with hunger, yes, but hunger wasn't always twisted. Something bent it, warped it, long ago." She motioned to the basket. "Go on." Ulrich untied the twine and slowly opened the lid. Inside was a loaf of bread. Perfectly round. Dusty with flour. Its crust bore no cracks, no imperfections. It looked warm, though no heat radiated from it. When he leaned in, the scent was intoxicating, not of yeast or grains, but of home. Of safety. Of something lost. He blinked. He was back in his mother's kitchen. His real mother. Before the famine. Before the pantry. Before war. She smiled at him. The fire crackled. Rain tapped softly on the windows. The smell of stew rose around him. "Eat," she said. "You've earned it." His hand reached toward the bread. Slap. The old woman knocked it aside. The bread rolled off the table and hit the floor. Ulrich gasped. The vision vanished. The room was cold again. His knees trembled. "Don't," she said. But he couldn't finish. His throat ached. "It wasn't real," she said gently. "That's its trick. It doesn't feed hunger. It feeds longing. And longing, once bloated, becomes poison." Ulrich stared at the bread. It had broken open. Inside wasn't dough, but pages. Thin, crumbling parchment. Written in a hand he didn't recognize, yet somehow did. Recipes. Meal of memory, recreates a lost day, perfectly. But the eater forgets all days after. Kindness porridge, warm, thick, and gently addictive. Makes all conflict vanish, along with the will to live. Final supper, tastes like peace. Kills like mercy. Ulrich gathered the papers and fed them, one by one, into the oven flames. They hissed and curled, releasing soft sighs as if grateful to be destroyed. But one page didn't burn. The fire licked it, but the ink remained. The parchment remained. It glowed faintly in silver script. It read, "Feast of Names, for when you must know who's still real." He held it up. The old woman's eyes widened. "This one," she whispered. "It's true." "What do you mean?" "There are people here who aren't who they once were. Not possessed. Not corrupted. Just replaced. This recipe reveals them." Ulrich nodded slowly. So that was it. The pantry had planted itself not just in dishes and desires, but in identities. In people. The next day, Ulrich prepared the Feast of Names. It was a dish unlike any other, a broth made from rainwater collected only at dusk, thickened with sap from a weeping birch, and stirred using a ladle carved from the bone of a remorseful ox. He added petals of remorse flower, a rare herb the old woman grew in secret, and a final pinch of salt from a barrel marked, "Truth." When it was ready, it shimmered blue in the pot. He served it only to those who volunteered. 12 villagers accepted bowls. One by one, they sipped. For some, nothing happened. They smiled softly, remembering who they were. Their eyes cleared, their posture straightened. Relief bloomed. But four of them changed. They twitched. They froze. Then their skin began to peel, not physically, but metaphorically. The person they had presented fell away like brittle paper. Beneath, something else squirmed, a shape with no face, no name, just a hunger. The villagers screamed. Ulrich and the old woman acted swiftly. She bound each with her woven string, chanting as she did. Ulrich poured holy vinegar into their mouths. The things wailed, then crumbled into sacks of old onions, fish bones, and moldy bread. The feast had worked. By sundown, the village understood. There had never been only one danger. The pantry didn't just poison food. It replaced reality, one bite at a time. People began to doubt their own memories. Not out of fear, but caution. They asked each other more questions. They shared stories at meals. They tested their truths, spoonful by spoonful, bite by bite. And Ulrich kept cooking. Each night, the recipe book grew. Each night, the pantry quieted a little more. And somewhere in the lowest layer of the earth, something deeper than the pantry stirred with unease. Because it had underestimated this boy. And the power of a good, honest meal. Morning returned with the clink of metal. Ulrich awoke to find the townsfolk reinforcing doors, hanging bundles of garlic and bitter root from their windows, and sharpening old farm tools with the grim precision of survivors. The Feast of Names had shaken them to their core, but it also did something else, it united them. For the first time in months, fear was no longer splintered and secret. It had a face. Or rather, it had lost one. Even so, not all was well. The pantry had grown quiet, but not silent. And that was worse. The old woman sat at the edge of the well in the square, weaving a thread of dried chamomile and beetle wings. She motioned to Ulrich as he passed. "It's learning," she said simply. Ulrich nodded. "It's hiding its ingredients now." "Not just that," she said. "It's stealing ours." He blinked. "What do you mean?" She pointed behind him. Ulrich turned. At the far end of the square, Father Darren, an ancient, sweet-natured priest who barely remembered his own age, was handing out wafer-thin biscuits to a group of children. They giggled and chewed as he muttered a prayer. Ulrich squinted. The biscuits glistened. That wasn't right. He rushed over, taking one from a child's hand and snapping it in half. Inside the wafer was something dark. Oozing. Not jam. Not meat. Something in between. "Where did you get these?" he asked Father Darren. The old priest smiled faintly. "They came to me in a vision. A recipe of comfort. For the little ones. They've had such nightmares, the poor things." Ulrich examined the priest more closely. His eyes were cloudy, but not from age. From suggestion. The pantry had entered his dreams. "Stop eating them," Ulrich cried to the children. Most obeyed, but one little boy, Timo, had already finished his second. He stared blankly ahead, then dropped his toy and wandered off, arms limp. "Timo!" Ulrich shouted. But the child was already humming a tune, low, guttural, and entirely wrong for a boy his age. By the time they found him, he had climbed onto the chapel roof and was biting pieces from the weathered stone cross at its peak. Ulrich climbed up after him and reached the child just as he bit too deep and chipped a tooth. He shrieked, not from pain, but from rage. The sound twisted in the air, becoming something sharp. The birds scattered. Ulrich whispered a quiet prayer and held the ladle over the boy's mouth. It vibrated violently, then began to glow. The boy slumped forward, unconscious. Ulrich carried him down, shaking. "He'll recover," the old woman said later. But there are more. The pantry had changed tactics again. It was now feeding through kindness. Through those who tried to help. Through the instincts that made people nurture one another. It was no longer using brute fear or obvious temptation. It was weaving itself into good intentions, making poison seem like medicine. Ulrich added a new line to his recipe book. "Warning cracker, looks like a biscuit. Smells like nostalgia. Screams when broken." He distributed them to villagers under strict instructions. If someone offered them food that was blessed, Or, divinely inspired, they were to break the cracker first. If it wailed, they would know to run. By week's end, the screams were fewer. But something else changed, too. The pantry's trapdoor remained sealed. Yet, in every building, every room, every field, there were new doors. Tiny ones. In the roots of trees. In oven walls. Under beds. All of them just large enough for something the size of a fist. Or a rat. Or a mouth. And out of each door came whispers. Ulrich caught them late one night. He was stirring a calming tea for a mother whose baby had refused to sleep since the Feast of Names. He bent down to check the herbs beneath the table, and there it was. A tiny wooden door, no taller than a mug, half open. From within came a whisper. Salt is sorrow. Sugar is sleep. Stir, 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 until the world forgets it weeps. He slammed the ladle against it. The door sealed shut. The next day, he and the old woman gathered every villager. Together, they scoured the homes and fields. Every tiny door was found and sealed, some with wax, some with dried wormwood, some with chalk drawn in old runes. But they could feel it. The pantry was branching. It had stopped being a place. It was becoming a network. A pantry without walls. A hunger without a kitchen. A mouth that could be anywhere. That night, Ulrich didn't sleep. He sat by the hearth, recipe book open, stirring a pot of stew that didn't exist in any real sense, made only of concepts, half-memories, ingredients that weren't edible but understandable. He wasn't cooking food. He was cooking meaning. The old woman joined him quietly. "Do you think we can win?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. Then, maybe not by starving it. But perhaps, by changing its taste. He looked at her. "What if," she said slowly, "we don't try to destroy it? What if we teach it better meals?" Ulrich blinked. "You want to feed the pantry. I want to untrain its tongue." It was madness. But so was everything else. Ulrich leaned over the bubbling stew and whispered a name into it. The name of a memory he had never shared, not with anyone, not even himself. A moment of mercy. A crumb of kindness. The stew shimmered. He dipped the ladle and poured it into a small wooden bowl. Then, without a word, he opened the trapdoor. And fed the pantry. The bowl vanished. And for the first time since the nightmare began, it said thank you. Green means it listened. Green means it grew. From then on, he cooked not from recipes, but from instinct. He began walking the forest for wild herbs, whispering thanks when he plucked a sprig. He cooked with children watching, and let them name the dishes. He even made a cheese wheel that mooed once before settling into perfect silence. But one night, one very still, starless night, the pantry spoke. Not with words. With a noise. It was a knock. From beneath the trapdoor. A slow, rhythmic knock. Knock, knock, knock. Ulrich and the Pepperwitch stood over it, breath held. Knock, knock. Then silence. And then, scratching. Not frantic, not desperate. Polite. As if something down there had been watching for a very long time and had finally grown curious. "I think it wants to eat," Ulrich whispered. "Or worse," the Pepperwitch said, "it wants a seat at the table." They didn't open it. Instead, Ulrich prepared his most powerful food yet. Not for the creature, but for the village. He cooked overnight, using every lesson he'd learned, every flavor he'd tasted, every mistake he'd burned. And in the morning, the people awoke to the smell of something that didn't belong in this century. It was bread, yes, but light as clouds, made of flour from dreams and yeast risen with forgiveness. He called it remembrance loaf. When they ate it, no one spoke. They didn't have to. They all remembered what it had cost to survive this long. And what it would cost to continue. After the meal, Ulrich stood before the pantry and opened the trapdoor. No heat. No glow. Just a long, downward stairwell that hadn't been there before. The Pepperwitch stepped beside him. You going down? He nodded. I think the cookbook wants me to serve the last course. Do you even know what that is? Ulrich shook his head. I just know it's hungry. And it's waiting. She looked at him for a long moment. Then handed him her obsidian spoon. Then don't just feed it. Teach it to cook. He descended. Step after step. The air grew colder, then warmer, then cold again. Like walking through the seasons of a single meal. Below, he found a room made of stone and bone. A long table sat in the center, with 12 chairs carved from old ovens. At the far end, a single figure sat, shrouded in steam and shadows. The deep table. It looked up. Its face was a roiling stew of all who had ever cooked, eaten, or starved. You are the baker, it said. Ulrich nodded. You have brought the end. No, Ulrich replied, holding up a loaf of the remembrance bread. I've brought a beginning. He placed it on the table. And waited. The creature stared, then took a bite, and it sighed. Not in hunger. Not in anger. But peace. The room around them changed. The chairs softened. The shadows lifted. And for a moment, a very brief moment, the hunger of the world felt full. The deep table said nothing more. It vanished, leaving Ulrich alone with only the echoes of meals past. He climbed the stairs, returning to a village bathed in the green light of a pantry that was no longer cursed, but invited. A place where stories could be baked, and wounds could be salted shut, and life could continue. One meal at a time. The scent of kindling soup lingered in the village air for days, though few had tasted it. It wasn't that Ulrich had made much. In fact, only a single bowl had gone into the pantry. But something about that soup, brewed with listening and memory and soft-spoken warmth, clung to the soil. It drifted from rooftop to root cellar, from hearth to hovel. Even the birds flew differently, less like they were fleeing, more like they were curious. For the first time in seasons, no one screamed in the night. But quiet could be dangerous, too. Because the pantry had gone quiet again, not the same heavy, watching quiet as before, but something contemplative. It felt like waiting in a room with someone behind a curtain. You could hear breathing, but you didn't know whose. Ulrich waited, too. Every evening, he brewed something simple. Porridge with tears of laughter. Biscuits of sibling forgiveness. Even one ill-fated pie of, almost love, which sizzled so hard in the pan it set the chimney on fire and summoned 3 ravens to watch silently from the windowsill. I suppose it wasn't ready for heartbreak yet, the old woman said dryly, helping to put the flames out with a bucket of pickled moss. She wasn't wrong. The pantry was still learning. But something else was happening. New recipes had begun appearing in Ulrich's book, ones he hadn't written. They emerged between the pages at dawn, sometimes scrawled in reverse, sometimes inked in fingerprints, sometimes stained with flour made from no grain he recognized. He didn't trust all of them. A few he burned, like the one titled, "Flesh of Longing Loaf, Kneaded with Envy. Risen in Jealousy. Best served cold and to someone who wronged you." He didn't even read the ingredients. But others felt possible. Like the pantry was trying, in its strange way, to reciprocate. To contribute. To create. Ulrich tried the ones that made sense, and even shared them with the villagers. One morning, a boy brought him a fruit. It grew from the old ash tree, he said, handing it over. Mama says not to eat it, but I think it smells like honey and clouds. Ulrich examined it. A soft, plum-like orb with faintly glowing skin. Inside it was a seed shaped like an ear. "Did you speak near it?" Ulrich asked. The boy nodded. "I told it I was scared. Then it fell." The tooth sat on Ulrich's counter for 3 days. He'd tried hiding it, under sackcloth, behind the spice jars, even beneath the blessed bread tin. But no matter where he tucked it, it moved back to the center of his work table each morning, always slick with dew and smelling faintly of burnt gingerbread. It wasn't just any tooth. It was a molar warning. A fossil from something older than hunger. Something older than kindness. A beast that had fed when the world was still baking its crust. The old woman called it ancestor rot. Pantries didn't always store food, she whispered, sitting beside the hearth. Once, they consumed it. Entire villages. Kingdoms, even. Every cupboard a mouth. Every jar a stomach. Ulrich stared at the thing. It was yellowed, etched with runes too shallow to read, and shaped more like a dagger than anything dental. What fed it? He asked. Belief. Shame. Sacrifice. There are hungers that cook reality itself. The villagers didn't know about the tooth. Not yet. Ulrich kept it secret, even from Gorik, who now spent most days walking slowly through town, eyes peeled, nostrils flaring, listening for whispers in the grain bins. But others noticed something was different. The children stopped drawing near the pantry. Birds stopped perching on the chimney. The flour turned heavy. The salt began to clump and hiss in the bowl. One night, Ulrich woke to find every single loaf of bread of listening he'd stored in his larder had been sliced, neatly, as if by a surgeon, and the words inside were missing. Only the crusts remained. He buried them with care. And whispered apologies over each. Something was stealing stories. The pantry had a shadow. And it was hungry. The next morning, the villagers gathered in the square again, unprompted. People were uneasy. Some had dreamed of being devoured by empty plates. Others swore their soup screamed when stirred. A girl, eyes wide with sleeplessness, said she saw something clawed emerge from her butter churn and lick the walls. Gorik stepped forward. "You've gone too far," he told Ulrich. "This isn't food anymore. This is theology." "No," Ulrich said. "It's something older. It's ritual. And something doesn't like that we've changed the menu." The old woman arrived, her cane dragging behind her like a root. "It wants to taste what we've been hiding. Our true flavors. The ones we've locked behind smiles and shame." "What do we do?" asked Rena the apothecary. "We don't give it what it wants," Ulrich said. "We give it something it can't digest." That night, he created the most dangerous recipe he'd ever dared. The sun rose late that morning, as if reluctant to peer down upon a world that had sent one of its own into the kitchen beneath kitchens, into the heart of a hunger older than time. Ulrich's face looked different now. Not older, but tasted. As though the lines around his mouth weren't from age or laughter but from being savored by something immense and unseen. Still, he walked with purpose. Behind him, the villagers waited with bated breath. They had expected screams, or ash, or a collapse of the pantry into some sinkhole of culinary damnation. Instead, they had watched the trapdoor glow gold, and Ulrich rise from it with the calm of someone who had fed a volcano and lived to tell the recipe. The old woman was the first to speak. "What did it say to you?" Ulrich didn't answer immediately. He looked at his hands, dusty with flour and something blacker, heavier, like charcoal made of regret. "It said recipes cost," he said. "Even the good ones." That quieted the crowd. They'd seen the damage inflicted by bad meals. The bread of regret that wept blood, the apple of memory that showed the worst day of your life in every bite, the jam of jealousy that caused hands to seize with envy. They'd fought these horrors. Now, to hear that even the kind food came with a price, that unsettled something deeper. "Then why keep cooking?" asked Gorik, arms crossed. "Because it's not about escaping the price," Ulrich replied. "It's about choosing what you're willing to pay." He turned to the pantry. The trapdoor was closed once more, silent. The strange warmth from below had faded, leaving only the ordinary must of old wood and stored air. It looked like it had when he first arrived, mundane, innocent. But they all knew better now. Ulrich took out a new notebook. Not the haunted one. A fresh one, bound in plain leather, unmarked by soot or salt or tears. He opened it to the first page and began to write. The stranger stayed. She never gave her name, though a few villagers began calling her Pepperwitch, half in jest and half in fear. She didn't mind. If anything, she seemed amused. She'd appear in the bakery without warning, her footsteps silent, her presence always heralded by the smell of crushed chilies and stormwater. Her mismatched eyes saw everything, flaws in dough, lies in words, memories clinging to soup. Ulrich didn't trust her, but he didn't send her away. She was part of the next recipe. The cookbook had made that clear. That night, as Ulrich lit the hearth, he found a new page already written in his clean ledger. Dish of 2 flames. Ingredients: 1 truth told too late, 1 secret kept too long. Requires 2 cooks, neither trusting the other. Heat with rivalry. Stir with shared need. Must be tasted at the same moment. One will speak, the other will burn. He didn't know how the recipes appeared in the book. He didn't ask. Some answers taste like poison. So, the Pepperwitch said, leaning against the doorway. "Shall we cook, or shall we wait for the world to rot?" Ulrich set out the ingredients. She brought none. Instead, she touched things. The black peppercorn jar. The old measuring spoon from Ulrich's brother. A knife she refused to use but insisted remain nearby. The kitchen felt like a battlefield. And in a way, it was. Neither of them spoke as they chopped, stirred, kneaded. She favored intensity, throwing things into the pot with abandon, eyes gleaming. He preferred care, measurement, the balance between flavor and memory. The heat in the room thickened. The air shimmered. And then, suddenly, the dish was done. A gray paste, slick and steaming, resting in 2 identical bowls. "On 3, she said. He nodded. 1, 2. They both ate. And the room changed. Not visibly, but emotionally. Ulrich suddenly remembered a boy's laughter, his brother, just days before the fire. The sharp pain of grief followed, like biting into glass. He winced, heart lurching. The Pepperwitch gasped. Tears streamed down her cheeks. "I lied," she whispered. "I fed an entire monastery to the sea. I told them it was a ritual of rebirth. But I was only hungry." The flames in the oven rose. Then fell. It was spring by the time Ulrich returned fully to himself. The strange stairwell to the deep table had disappeared the day after his return, sealed up as though it had never existed. The trapdoor remained, of course, but it was simply wood again. Not humming, not glowing, just wood. But Ulrich was not the same. Neither was the village. The bread he'd brought back, the remembrance loaf, became legend. No one could replicate it, not even Ulrich, though he tried. It wasn't about the ingredients. It was about the moment it had come from. And moments, like ripe fruit, spoil when you try to freeze them. The villagers now brought offerings to the bakery each week, not out of fear, but tradition. Things they'd foraged, preserved, or grown. A bundle of rosemary tied in black thread. A rare purple carrot grown under a blood moon. One child brought a smooth, pale egg that never spoiled, claiming she'd found it in a dream. Ulrich took them all, smiling. He didn't always use them. Some, he buried behind the bakery in the herb garden. Others he placed on the pantry shelves like keepsakes. Still others he used in subtle ways, just a pinch, just a scrape, to flavor a dish that needed a whisper of the strange. The Pepperwitch remained, though her role had changed. No longer an observer, she became a teacher of sorts. She taught the village how to dry bitterness without burning it. How to pickle grief so it turned sweet over time. How to stir shame until it rose like pride. Her presence, once ominous, now felt like seasoning, sharp but essential. One day, Rena asked Ulrich a simple question. "Are you finished?" He was kneading dough at the time. He stopped. Finished with what? With the cookbook. With the pantry. With the hunger. He considered this. "No," he said. "But I'm not afraid of it anymore." Rena nodded. "That's close enough to finished for me." But he did fear something else. Complacency. For when people feel full for too long, they forget what hunger taught them. And when the world forgets hunger, it comes back worse. To guard against this, Ulrich began a new tradition. Each full moon, he would cook a dish from memory, not his own, but someone else's. The villagers would come one by one, sit beside him, and tell him a story they hadn't told anyone. A shame, a longing, a moment they never forgave themselves for. He would listen, he would cook, and they would eat their burden, transformed. These dishes could not be replicated. One was a plum tart that made a mother remember her lost daughter's lullaby. Another was a blackened root stew that made a man finally cry over his father's grave. A third, made from corn and apples and cracked salt, made an old soldier forget a single scream that had haunted him for decades. Each one was a quiet victory. But even victories, Ulrich knew, leave crumbs. The hunger had grown, but it was no longer wild, not entirely. It had teeth, yes, but it had manners now. The new taster, though unseen, became something of a presence in the bakery. Ulrich began to leave out small offerings. The burnt edge of a tart, a too salty biscuit, the final spoonful of stew no one ever ate. Each offering vanished by morning. Sometimes, something was left behind, a dusting of cinnamon in the shape of a spiral. A stone that smelled faintly of cloves. Once, a note made of onion skin that read simply, "Still learning." The villagers began to speak of the new taster with a strange fondness. The children left crusts near hollow logs. Gorik carved a small stool and placed it at the edge of the hearth, in case it wants to sit and watch. Rena made a meat pie with a fanged smile cut into its top and called it, Taster's Tongue. Even the Pepperwitch began to refer to it casually. Feed the oven, feed the air, feed the thing that's always there. But Ulrich felt something uneasy simmering under it all. The cookbook had not written a new recipe in weeks. It watched, of course. The pages sometimes fluttered without wind. The ink shimmered when Ulrich passed near. But it offered no new instruction. No cursed dish. No healing meal. As if it were, waiting. The pantry itself had grown warm again, but not fevered. Expectant. And then came the morning where the bread didn't rise. Ulrich tried 3 times. Each loaf collapsed in the center, as if something had sucked the life from it. The yeast was fine, the flour fresh, the process perfect, and yet, each loaf died. The 4th time, he heard it. A soft voice, not spoken, felt. Spring gave way to summer, and the bakery became the warm heart of the village. The fear was gone now, replaced by reverence, not for the pantry, or even the cookbook, but for the act of cooking itself. Each dish Ulrich prepared was no longer a ward against darkness, but a celebration of light. And yet, he felt the difference. The recipes he made now were lighter, simpler, almost childlike. Honey cakes shaped like stars. Herbal broth that made you hum when you sipped it. Porridge that sang gently if you stirred it just right. The magic hadn't vanished, it had matured. The Pepperwitch began collecting stories instead of ingredients. She traveled between villages and brought back folklore and flavor alike. A pastry that only rose if you told it a secret, a pickled beet that turned blue when someone nearby was lying. Ulrich incorporated them all, delighted. But deep within him, he knew something was ending. And something else was beginning. He saw it in the way Rena cooked now, confident, hands steady, laughter bubbling at her lips like a pot just starting to boil. He saw it in the quiet monk, who no longer sat in the back but had begun crafting wooden spoons and carving prayers into the handles. He saw it in the children, who no longer asked about the haunted pantry because to them, it never had been. And he saw it most clearly in the new taster. For now it had a form. Not a face, not exactly, but a shape, like a child wrapped in steam and sugar. It no longer skulked in corners. It sat on the little stool Gorik had made. It waited for its taste like any proper guest. And sometimes, only sometimes, it smiled. One afternoon, as Ulrich folded dough for his famous rosemary hand pies, the Pepperwitch approached with a strange expression on her face. "I think it's time," she said. He looked up. "Time for what?" "For you to let go." Ulrich stared at her. "She didn't mean the pies." "You mean the bakery." She nodded. "And the cookbook. And the pantry." He shook his head. "But it's not finished. There's more to make. More to learn." "Is there?" she asked gently. "You've cooked every sorrow, healed every hunger. The village no longer fears the dark. Even the hunger has found a place at the table." He set down the dough. Ulrich wandered, but he was never truly lost. His feet carried him from hamlet to hamlet, through forests dappled with foxglove and valleys where shepherds waved from distant hills. He never traveled with more than a pack of essentials: dried herbs, a wrapped loaf, and a spoon carved by the monk, etched with the words "stir with care." Everywhere he went, people recognized something in him, though they never knew his name. They called him the traveling cook, the wander kneader, the bread father. They invited him in. They told him their troubles. And they fed him. It was the quiet feeding that meant the most. A bowl of bitter root stew shared under a lean-to. A wild berry tart, the crust cracked in bleeding sweet juice, offered with trembling hands from a widow. A plate of boiled nettles from a boy who'd burned them twice and kept trying anyway. Ulrich never judged. He only tasted, smiled, and asked one question. "Would you like to know how to make it mean more?" In time, these villages began to change. A lonely woman in one valley built a clay oven behind her home and began baking rosemary scones that made people weep. A blind man, who had never tasted sweetness since the death of his daughter, learned to make a sorbread so rich with memory that even ravens lingered on his roof to smell it. Word spread, not of Ulrich, but of food that spoke. Food that remembered. And slowly, quietly, the hunger changed. In a village carved into the cliffs, Ulrich met a girl who dreamed of building an oven into the side of the mountain. She had sketches of it, with chimney flutes that would sing when the bread rose. She had never tasted a cursed thing, but she knew what it meant to feed someone's grief. Ulrich stayed long enough to help her lay the first stones. Then he moved on. In a swampy village overrun with fungus, he taught the locals how to tame mold into flavor, not fear. Together, they brewed a stew that could calm tremors and hush old nightmares. The Pepperwitch visited briefly, nodding in approval before vanishing back into the marsh with a smirk. Even the cookbook found a new rhythm. Ulrich carried it now, though the pages remained mostly blank. But each village added something. A drawing, a symbol, a few words scratched in with dirty fingers or soot-black ink. Not recipes, per se, but moments. Like pinches of life added to a great bubbling pot. One night, in a place where the stars blinked like oven embers, Ulrich sat beside a dying man who offered him a slice of bark bread. "It's all I have," the man said. Ulrich took a bite and chewed slowly. It was bitter, dry, flecked with moss, and perfect. "I never fed anyone before," the man whispered. "You just did," Ulrich said. "And I'll remember." He buried the man the next morning. And he left behind a pot of stew on the man's hearth, made from moss, bark, and a single fistful of salt the village elder had given him in silence. It fed 15 people. They called it quiet soup. Ulrich kept walking. The further he went, the more the world changed. There were fewer haunted kitchens. Fewer cursed pickles. Fewer whispered recipes passed like warnings. But there were more flavors. More creativity. More laughter in the kitchens. Children no longer feared the pantry. They painted on its walls. One day, far from the village of his youth, Ulrich arrived at a crossroads where 4 market stalls met. Each stall sold strange snacks: honeyed ants wrapped in lavender leaves, cheese aged beneath frozen lakes, candied garlic dipped in mead. He stood in the center, smiling. A young woman approached, apron dusted in flour, hair tied back with string. "You're the one who taught my teacher," she said. "The one who made the sorrow stew." Ulrich chuckled. "I've made a few." She held out a small pastry. It was folded like a letter. He bit into it. A burst of rosewater and clove. A hint of ash. Something deeply, gently mournful. "My brother died last winter," she said. "This is how I talk to him." He chewed carefully. Swallowed. "It's perfect," he said. "Still needs work," she said. "But I'm learning." They smiled at each other. And for the first time in months, the cookbook opened on its own. The blank pages shimmered with a warm, golden light. A new entry formed. Course. The shared table. Ingredients. One memory, well seasoned. One grief, boiled down. One joy, sliced thin. Many hands. Instructions. 1. Open your door. 2. Let them sit. 3. Feed them. 4. Eat, together. Outcome. Hope. Ulrich laughed quietly. Not out of relief. Not out of surprise. But out of the simple, filling joy of knowing. The story was still being written. And it wasn't his alone anymore. Would you like to continue with part 20, the final part? The sun hung low over the fields, casting long golden shadows across the wheat. Wind stirred the stalks like whispers from old friends. Ulrich walked the road back to his village, not out of need, but of longing. Enough time had passed. The pain that once clung to the walls like soot had lifted. He wanted to see what had grown in the garden of his departure. The village had changed. Children ran freely between houses, some of which now had little chimneys shaped like spoons or ladles. Someone had carved a signpost near the gate. "Welcome to Hearthmere. We feed everything." The bakery still stood, and it glowed brighter than ever. Vines of thyme and marjoram climbed its walls, and flowerpots bloomed on every windowsill. Laughter spilled from the open door. He stepped inside. Rena stood behind the counter, flour up to her elbows, her face flushed from oven heat. She saw him, and the joy on her face was like a bell rung across a still lake. "You came back," she said. "Wasn't sure I could stay away," he replied. The new taster sat at the table near the pantry, more formed now than ever, a little more human, a little less hungry. It waved. Ulrich took a seat beside it. I hear the scones don't burn anymore. They burn less, Rena grinned. But only because Gorik made a rotating oven shelf. He always was clever. The Pepperwitch arrived moments later, unannounced as usual, chewing absently on a licorice root. Thought I felt a warm breeze pass over my stew, she said. Should have known it was your boots stirring the dust. They shared a meal. A simple one. Soup with bread. Apple slices drizzled in honey. Spiced tea. No dark magic. No sorrow folded into dough. Just flavor. Love. Home. Afterward, Ulrich stood beside the pantry. The door was still open. Inside, the shelves were tidy. The air clean. Not a single green glow or echo of distant whispers. The cookbook sat in the middle of the top shelf, worn at the edges but fuller than ever. Its pages, once blank, were now crowded with writing, not in Ulrich's hand, but in dozens of others. Some scribbled, some elegant, some childish. Memories, meals, lessons, lives. He pulled it down and opened it to the final page. It was almost full. But there was still space for one more recipe. He took out the monk's spoon, dipped it in ink, and wrote. Final recipe, the end of hunger. Ingredients. A long road, a warm fire. One mistake, well learned. Every hand that fed you. Every voice that thanked you. A table set for more than yourself. Instructions. 1. Walk. 2. Feed and be fed. 3. Tell the truth in flavor. 4. Leave the door open. Outcome. A world where the pantry no longer needs to be feared. He closed the book gently. Then turned to Rena. It's yours now. She hesitated. Are you sure? He nodded. I was always just the first. Not the last. She took it with trembling hands, the weight of it familiar already. I'll guard it, she whispered. Don't guard it, he said. Use it. Fill it. Let others write too. The sun was setting as Ulrich stepped outside. He felt full, not with food, but with everything that had passed. The darkness, the fear, the hunger, the healing. It was all there, simmering within him like a pot long on the boil. But now, it was time to cool. He walked to the hill where the old bakery had once burned. He sat, and for the first time in years, he simply breathed. No hunger stirred, no craving clawed at his ribs. The world was fed, and he had helped. That night, across the village, a new kind of recipe began to spread. One not written in ink, but in voice, in care, in acts of sharing and trust. And the hunger, once cursed and crawling and bottomless, settled at last into something beautiful. Appetite. Not for food alone, but for stories, for each other, for peace. And in that warm dusk, with the smell of baking bread drifting from the chimneys and laughter floating through the trees, the old hunger was forgotten. Not destroyed, transformed.